자기야? 이게 어떻게 된 일이야? 아니 말도 안 돼! 이게 다 내 탓이야. 용서할 수 없어.
What is this?
They made me do it.
My own family.
Negligence becomes revelation when you return to find that the people you trusted with your wife's safety have treated her as less than human. Min-jae Park learned that lesson in the marble foyer of his family's mansion in Bangkok when he arrived home unexpectedly after 6 months away on business and found his wife Solange, the woman he had married against his family's wishes, the woman he had left in the care of his mother and his brother's wife. On her hands and knees scrubbing the floor with a worn brush, wearing servants' clothing instead of the elegant dresses he had left her with, moving with the careful precision of someone whose left leg had been damaged 3 years earlier in the accident that had taken everything from her except her life. Min-jae was 41, had spent 20 years building himself from street enforcer to boss of Bangkok's most powerful organized crime syndicate. He controlled trade routes, gambling operations, money laundering networks that stretched across Southeast Asia. He was feared by rivals and respected by his organization, the kind of man whose presence in a room changed the atmosphere, whose decisions affected the lives of hundreds of people. He was also a man who had fallen completely in love with a woman his family considered unsuitable. Solange was 37, had been a concert pianist before the accident. She was American, Black, from New Orleans, had come to Bangkok to perform at international music festivals 7 years earlier. She had been beautiful then, her hands moving across piano keys with impossible grace, her music filling concert halls with emotion and technical brilliance. Min-jae had attended one of her performances on a night when he was supposed to be conducting business, but had decided to take a break. He had been transfixed, not just by her talent, but by the joy she expressed through music, by the way she seemed to transcend the world of violence and darkness he inhabited. He had pursued her relentlessly over the following months. She had resisted. She knew what he was, knew that his world was incompatible with her values, knew that loving him would require accepting things she found morally indefensible. But she had loved him anyway. They had married in secret, had built a life together that existed in the spaces between his criminal empire and her attempt to maintain moral clarity. She had continued to perform when she could. He had tried to keep the violent details of his work away from her. For 3 years, it had worked. Then came the accident. A rival organization had discovered that Solange was Min-jae's wife. They had seen her as leverage, as a vulnerability they could exploit. They had arranged for her car to be tampered with, brake lines cut, a threat designed to send a message to Min-jae about what could happen to people he loved. The car had crashed on a Bangkok street. Solange had survived, but barely. Her left leg had been shattered, her spine had been damaged. The recovery had been months of surgery and physical therapy and pain that no medication fully relieved. She had eventually learned to walk again. With the help of a cane, with the help of physical therapy, with the help of someone whose sheer determination refused to accept that the accident would permanently define her capabilities. But the career was over. Concert performance required 2 fully functional legs, required the ability to move with precision and grace across a stage. She could walk, could manage daily life, but she could not perform at the level that had defined her professional identity. She had spent 3 years grieving the loss of that identity while trying to build a new life that made peace with her limitations. When Min-jae had received the call that a significant business problem required his immediate attention in Macau, he had hesitated. Solange had insisted he go. "I'll be fine. Your mother and your sister-in-law will be here. I'm perfectly capable of managing for a few months." Min-jae had arranged for live-in nurses, had left detailed instructions about Solange's physical therapy requirements, had ensured that his wife would receive the care and support she needed. He had not anticipated that his mother and sister-in-law would view an injured wife as a servant rather than as a family member. What Min-jae had left behind was a woman who had every resource available to her: nurses, physical therapists, money, access to anything she needed. What he had failed to consider was that his mother, who had always resented his marriage to Solange, might use his absence as opportunity to demonstrate exactly what she thought of a woman she considered unworthy of her son. The transition had been gradual. First, his mother had suggested that Solange might benefit from staying busy, from having purpose beyond just physical therapy. Solange, already struggling with grief about her lost career, had welcomed the idea of having something meaningful to do. So she had begun to help with household tasks. Small things initially, organizing items in the kitchen, sorting laundry, tasks that didn't require standing for extended periods. But then the requests had expanded. Could she help with cleaning? Could she manage the meals for the household? Could she supervise the servants? Could she handle the housekeeping responsibilities that typically fell to a housekeeper? The nurses Min-jae had hired were gradually dismissed as unnecessary. His mother had determined that Solange's physical therapy could be managed without professional oversight. The cooks had been reassigned to other duties, leaving Solange to prepare meals. The cleaning staff had been reduced, leaving Solange responsible for maintaining the massive mansion. By the time Min-jae had been in Macau for 3 months, Solange had essentially become a servant in the household where she was technically the lady of the estate. She had not complained. Not in the messages she sent to Min-jae. Not in the calls they made when his schedule allowed. She had simply accepted the situation as she had accepted so many difficult things, with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that resistance often made circumstances worse, not better. But her messages had become shorter. Her voice on the phone had become quieter. Her enthusiasm for life had dimmed into something that resembled endurance more than actual living. Min-jae had noticed the changes, but had attributed them to the difficulty of managing her disability, to the grief that still surfaced sometimes about the career she had lost. He had been distracted by business problems in Macau, by the complications of managing his organization, by the belief that Solange was safe because she was surrounded by family. He had been catastrophically wrong. The business problem in Macau had been resolved faster than anticipated. Min-jae had decided to return home early, thinking he would surprise Solange, would take her somewhere beautiful for a week, would help her move past whatever depression seemed to be affecting her. He had arrived home in the late afternoon, had entered through the front doors expecting to be greeted by his wife or by household staff. Instead, he had found Solange on her hands and knees in the marble foyer, wearing faded gray servant's clothing, scrubbing the floor with a worn brush. For a moment, he had not understood what he was looking at. His mind had refused to process the image. His wife, elegant, educated, a woman who had filled concert halls with her music. On her hands and knees doing servant's work, moving with careful precision because her left leg could not support extended weight, her hair wrapped in a servant's cloth, her beautiful face focused on the task of cleaning the floor that should have been cleaned by hired staff. He had made a sound, something between a shout and a cry, and Solange had looked up. Her expression had shifted through surprise and fear and something like resignation, as if she had always known this moment would come, as if she had been waiting for him to discover what his family had been doing in his absence. Min-jae, I didn't expect you until next week. He had helped her to her feet, his hands shaking with fury, and he had demanded explanation from her, from his mother, from his sister-in-law. What he had discovered was systematic cruelty disguised as family dynamics. His mother had resented Solange since before they married. She had considered her son's marriage to a Black American woman as betrayal, as evidence that he was putting his individual desires above family loyalty and social status. She had spent 3 years waiting for opportunity to demonstrate that Solange was unsuitable, that she did not belong in their family, that she would always be beneath them. The accident had provided that opportunity. His sister-in-law had initially just followed his mother's lead, but over 6 months she had actively participated in the humiliation. She had complained that Solange was not keeping the house clean enough. She had demanded that Solange prepare meals to her specifications. She had instructed the household staff to take orders from Solange rather than to help her, essentially making her responsible for managing tasks that required physical capability she no longer possessed. The nurses had been dismissed not because they were unnecessary, but because my mother had decided that Solange's pain medication should be withheld except when absolutely necessary. She has become too dependent on painkillers. She needs to learn to manage without them. Physical therapy had been stopped because his mother had determined that Solange was not committed enough to her own recovery. The result was that Solange's physical condition had actually deteriorated. The leg that had been healing was now deconditioned. The pain she had been learning to manage had become constant, and her mental state had shifted from grief about her lost career into something closer to depression. She deserved it, his mother had said when Min-jae confronted her. She seduced you away from your responsibilities. She made you weak. She brought suffering to this family when that car was sabotaged. It was her presence in your life that created this situation. She should have accepted that she was not good enough for you and left. Min-jae had spent 3 years trying to protect his wife by leaving her in what he believed were safe hands. What he had actually done was leave her vulnerable to people who resented her and who had used her disability as justification for abuse. He had left his wife with people who had treated her as a servant, who had withheld medical care, who had worked to isolate her and break her, who had convinced themselves that their cruelty was justified. And Solange, who had already lost so much, had simply endured. That night, Min-jae had arranged for Solange to be evaluated by the physicians he trusted. What they discovered confirmed his worst fears. Her physical condition had deteriorated significantly, her pain management was inadequate, and her mental health was deeply compromised by 6 months of isolation and systematic mistreatment. He had confronted his organization's operations manager about the business in Macau being handled without his presence. He had consolidated his operations, ensuring that critical decisions could be made by trusted lieutenants, creating a structure that would not collapse if he was not personally overseeing every aspect. And then he had removed his wife from his family's house. Not angrily, not with dramatic confrontation, but with absolute clarity that she would never spend another night under his mother's roof, that his family's resentment of her was no longer his problem, that protecting his wife required separating her from people who had used her vulnerability against her. He had rented a private house on the outskirts of Bangkok, had hired new medical staff specifically trained in caring for people recovering from both physical and psychological trauma, had brought in physical therapists who specialized in recovery from disuse and deconditioning. And then he had done something that surprised everyone who knew him. He had made significant changes to his own life. He had stepped back from day-to-day management of his criminal organization, designating trusted lieutenants to handle operations that did not require his direct oversight. He had created a structure where he could be present in Solange's life without abandoning his business interests. The first month of Solange's recovery had been the most difficult. She had been angry in ways she had not been angry before. The grief she had processed about her lost career had been channeled into fury about the abuse she had endured while she was vulnerable, while she had been trusting that his family would care for her. I should have seen what was happening. I should have forced you to leave. I should have. You should have been able to trust that your husband's family would not treat you like a servant. You should have been able to believe that they would respect your dignity and care for your well-being. That's what should have happened. That they did the opposite is on them, not on you. But rebuilding trust required more than just removing her from his family's house. It required him to acknowledge what his absence had enabled, to accept responsibility for leaving her in the care of people he should have known were unreliable, to commit to never again prioritizing his business interests above her safety and well-being. It also required him to address his family directly. He had arranged a meeting with his mother in neutral territory, his office, surrounded by people who worked for him, in a space where his mother could not control the environment. Solange is my wife. She is family. What you did to her while I was away was unforgivable. What you allowed to happen to her body and her mind while she was vulnerable was cruelty that no family relationship justifies. She never belonged. That is your opinion, and you are entitled to it. But you are not entitled to act on that opinion by abusing someone in my care. You are not entitled to withhold medical treatment. You are not entitled to humiliate her. You are not entitled to use her disability as justification for treating her like a servant. She was lazy. She was using her injury as excuse. She was recovering from an accident that was orchestrated to hurt me, and you decided to use her vulnerability to demonstrate your resentment. And I am telling you that if you ever contact her again, if you ever attempt to see her, if you ever try to influence her in any way, the consequences will be severe enough that you will understand what actual cruelty looks like. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was simply Min-jae drawing a line and making clear that there were consequences for crossing it. Over the following months, Solange's physical condition began to improve under proper care. Her pain was managed with appropriate medication. Her physical therapy progressed systematically under guidance of specialized therapists. Her deconditioning began to reverse as she was able to return to gentle exercise without the barrier of constant pain. Her psychological recovery was slower. She had developed anxiety about being left alone. She had internalized the message that she was a burden, that her disability made her less valuable, that she should be grateful for whatever treatment she received rather than expecting respect and dignity. Min-jae worked with trauma specialists to help her process what had happened, to help her understand that her disability did not diminish her value, that she was not responsible for his family's cruelty, that she deserved to be treated with the respect that any human being deserves. 6 months after her removal from his family's house, Solange began to play piano again. Not for performance. Not initially. Just for herself, in the music room Min-jae had set up in their new house. She started with simple pieces that did not require extended standing, pieces that allowed her to reconnect with music without the pressure of meeting pre-injury standards. Min-jae would sometimes listen from the next room, hearing the music that had first drawn him to her, understanding that her recovery was not just physical but spiritual. She was reclaiming the part of herself that had been stolen, not by the accident, but by 6 months of being treated as worthless. 1 year after finding her on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor, Min-jae arranged a small concert for Solange. Not a public performance, just an intimate gathering in their home. Close friends, the medical team that had helped with her recovery, people who understood what she had endured and what her music represented. She performed pieces that she had adapted to accommodate her physical limitations. She performed with a technical skill that the disability had not diminished, even though the physical demands of concert performance had made that career impossible. She performed with the joy of someone who had reclaimed something that had been taken from her. Not the career, but the connection to music itself. And in the audience, Min-jae watched his wife perform, and he understood what it meant to fail someone and then commit to never failing them again. After the concert, Solange approached him. "Thank you for bringing me home. I should have been there to protect you from ever needing rescue.
No.
You should have trusted that your family would respect me. But when you discovered what happened, you chose me. You chose my safety over your family loyalty. That's what matters." Over the following years, Solange and Min-jae rebuilt their marriage on a foundation of honesty that it had been missing before. Min-jae continued to manage his criminal organization, but he did so with clear boundaries about how much time and energy it would consume. Solange found new purpose in teaching music to children with disabilities, connecting her recovery experience with her passion for helping others. They never had children. The physical trauma from the accident and the psychological impact of the abuse had created complications that made pregnancy inadvisable. But they built a life together that was full, meaningful, grounded in mutual respect and genuine partnership. 5 years after finding her on her knees scrubbing the floor, Min-jae was approached by someone claiming to represent his mother. She was ill, apparently, and was requesting that he visit her, that they reconcile before she died. He declined, not with anger, not with dramatic rejection, but with absolute clarity that reconciliation would require acknowledgement of what she had done, genuine remorse, and commitment to respecting his wife, and his mother offered none of those things. "I have forgiven her for her resentment. I have moved past my anger about what she did, but I will not expose my wife to her again. That is the boundary, and it is permanent." His mother died without reconciliation, and Min-jae, who had spent his life managing complex power dynamics in his criminal organization, had to apply those same skills to his family, setting boundaries, enforcing consequences, protecting the person he loved from people who would damage her if given opportunity. 10 years after the accident that had taken Solange's concert career, she recorded an album. Adaptive pieces for disabled musicians, music that demonstrated that disability did not diminish artistry, that recovery was not about returning to pre-injury function but about finding new ways to express the gifts you still possessed. The album was small, released independently, never intended for a commercial success. But it found its audience. Musicians with disabilities, people in recovery from trauma, people who needed to hear that loss did not define you, that adaptation was not failure, that there were ways to build meaningful lives even after circumstances had fundamentally changed what those lives could look like. And Min-jae, the man who had built his life on power and control and fear, had learned that the most important power he could exercise was the power to protect someone he loved, to acknowledge when he had failed them, to commit to never failing them in the same way again. The woman who had been treated as a servant in the mansion where she should have been honored had found her voice not in concert halls, but in her own home, playing music that documented her recovery, her resilience, her refusal to be defined by the people who had tried to diminish her. And the man who had left her vulnerable had spent the rest of his life making sure she would never be vulnerable like that again.